for 11 years, and they planted quite a few churches. They planted a regular church and a few deaf churches even. So they are now with an organization called GSI, and their organization has 200 missionaries nationwide that are planting churches in unreached, unengaged people groups. So here they are.
Thank you. Good morning. Before Greg shares, I just wanted to share a little bit about Siberia. And we had lived in Florida for a really good reason, because we really loved warm weather, but we wanted to go to an unreached place in the world where people did not have the opportunity to hear about Jesus. And so the Lord laid Siberia on our hearts. And just to give you an idea of where we lived, when we landed in Moscow, we trained 5 days east to Ulan-Ude, where we lived. It's right above Mongolia, and we work with the Buryat people who were Tibetan Buddhists and shamanists, kind of like really into witchcraft. And it was just an incredibly new experience in a place that we could never have imagined. It is as cold as you might have heard. It gets to be about minus 50 in the winters. It was too cold for clouds in the winters. It was quite sunny, but it snowed in the fall and the spring when it was actually warmer. The people sell food outside all year long, so we would go down there. I mean, even if it's minus 30, they're still selling frozen carrots or cabbage or potatoes or horse meat. And one time a neighbor brought something over to me as a gift, and it was kind of this white thing with a string, and I thought it was kind of a ugly-looking candle. I did not know what it was. And then it was starting to melt on my counter, and I realized it was milk. And so what the farmers do is they milk their cows into little different-sized buckets, and they let it freeze, and they would bring it in on trucks, and you would just kind of pick up your milk and carry it home on a rope and melt it, boil it, and strain it, and then you could drink it. So definitely huge learning curves of living there. But Greg will share a little bit more about why we went and what the Lord did there.
Hey guys, good to see you guys. I'm going to show you just a couple of pictures here if this thing works. And now it's not, because the power is probably not on. But I don't know how to do that, so there it goes. I just want to just kind of begin a little bit as I start back a little bit. My wife and I served in Siberia for a number of years. Then after that, we moved to China and lived in China for a bit. And God allowed us to see certain parts of the world that a lot of people have never seen before. It was sort of an interesting time for us. But when I was younger, a long time ago, I'd heard about missions. And so I don't know how much you guys have heard about missions. I know this is a Christian school. I know you guys probably have people coming in talking about missions a lot. I grew up in an area where my parents talked a lot about what missions was and what missions was like. But one of the things I really wanted to do when I was younger is I actually wanted to do something that was like, in some ways, I guess in my own life, I want to make a difference in the world. I actually wanted to be somebody that was going to make a difference. I didn't want to just kind of just go through the motions my entire life and just live my life and just not have done anything or not have done some of the things that I felt that God had called me to do or be a part of. So when I was 17 years old, though, I was about, I guess at that time, kind of still understanding more about my role, who God was. I wasn't really walking with the Lord at 17. I was kind of doing everything else that most people do as a 17-year-old, except for the things that I think I really should have been focusing on, which was really understanding who God is. But my family I grew up in a family that really talked a lot about the world. And my dad was a Canadian, my mom was American, so we knew about a little bit going to that part of the country. Canada was kind of close. My aunt and uncles and relatives lived in South America, and my uncle was a missionary pilot in Colombia, South America. So at 17 years old, I graduated from high school, and I had a chance to go for the summer to Colombia, South America, which for me was sort of like a dream. Like I had sort of always thought that, first off, I was raised in Michigan, and so I hated cold weather. And so I thought, well, that'd be great. I'll go to a hot weather place. I'll be in the jungles of South America. That'd be really cool. So I went down there and started to work in South America. And while I was there, I had a chance to go down to work on this one place. It was actually called this huge area of Colombia where there's different people groups. I don't know if you guys know what people groups are or even understand it, but you probably do from this area a little bit. But what were people groups that lived there? There were people living in South America, in Colombia, South America, that although the national language was Spanish, they actually didn't speak Spanish at all. They didn't know one word of Spanish. They spoke their own languages, which meant one thing, that if someone wanted to know about Jesus in Colombia, wanted to know who Jesus was, wanted to know what Jesus had done for them, wanted to know that Jesus had died for them, there's no way they could have ever known. Because there's nobody that spoke that language that knew about Jesus. So that meant that these guys, although they lived in that area, would never have the opportunity to hear about Jesus Christ. Ever have the opportunity to hear about Jesus Christ. And so these missionaries are working, and they're trying to work with these guys that live there. And that was a pretty challenging place to be, partly because there was a lot of things happening in the area at that time. At this time that I was there, it was just the beginning of a lot of the issues going on with revolution taking place in the country. A pretty significant amount of revolution was taking place in the country where the government that was existing in that area was being attacked pretty strongly. So it was pretty common to be sitting out there on the riverfront. We'd be out there in the jungles and watch these riverboats go by. They were gunboats basically going by, looking for criminals, looking for guys that were what they were considering at the time, which was a big threat for them, was communists. So they were looking for communists. They'd go up and down the river, and you're watching that take place. And every once in a while, you'd hear stories about somebody being killed in one place, a battle taking place in another area. But all those things were happening at that time while I was down there working. And as we were working in this one area to build this airstrip in the jungle, we were doing these things where we were actually trying to give gifts out to these Indians that were there. They were called the Macu Indians. And the Macu didn't speak Spanish. They spoke Macu. And so we didn't actually speak Macu. I spoke Spanish, and I spoke some of the other languages in the area, but I didn't speak Macu. So we were trying to get out to those areas. And one of the things that the Macu would do was at night, they would try to, they didn't understand why we were there. They were being killed off by the communists that were up in the other areas, so they were threatened all the time. And so for us to be in that area, it was kind of an interesting time period. I remember being 17 thinking to myself, I didn't picture ever in my life being in a situation like this. I wasn't raised in Michigan with any kind of context for this. And this just felt different. It felt really different for me. And as we were out there working through these issues and understanding what these guys were like, I began to realize the complexities and the challenges of working in these areas. I also realized that I wasn't sure why I was there. One day we went down this gift trail. The Macu, we lived on these two houses out in the water, because at night, like I said, the Macu would come in and they would shoot blow darts at us, actually what they would do. And they couldn't reach the boats, our houses where we were living. And so, but they would yell at night all the time. And I still remember the word. They said, Bombaye. I never knew what Bombaye meant. But I would just stand on this boat, on this house, and I would yell back, Bombaye, and they would get really mad. So I don't know what I was saying, but it was probably not a good word. And I was yelling back at them the same word, and they would get really mad. So we would go back and forth. So one day, we actually left them PVC pipe. PVC pipe is a better blow dart gun in some ways to shoot it. What we didn't think of, though, was the fact that now they could actually hit the houses they were in. So at night, we used to hear them shoot the blow darts in. We'd pick up the blow darts in the water. Now they would be hitting the roof, the steel roof of the house, as we would sit out there. Wasn't the brightest idea to do. But it was a way for us to build this relationship over time. Well, we were out there for quite a long time, and I remember going back. One day I went back. I cut my foot pretty bad, and I had to go back from where we were, and it was 7 days by canoe back to where this base was, where these missionaries were basing out of. And so I traveled back there by 7 days by canoe. I had hurt my foot kind of bad, and I was sitting there by this river again, and there was this guy standing there. He was this Indian guy. He was a chief of this tribe called the Guajibos. And he asked me, I had learned a little, one of the guys I was working with in the Macu area was a Guajibo, so I had learned some Guajibo language, not much, and this chief knew a little bit of Spanish. And he asked me a question. He said, why are you out there at the Macu place? And I was 17. I'm just helping, but I knew why the missionaries were there. I said, well, they're there, we're building an airstrip out there. So I was building an airstrip. And he said, but what are you doing it for? To tell the Macu about Jesus. He said, who's Jesus? And I didn't have the words in Guajibo to explain to him who Jesus was. And I said, he's God. I knew that word. And he said, when will someone come and tell the Guajibo about Jesus? And I said, dude, I don't know. I'm not going to do it. I don't want to come here. I didn't want to go to the Guajibo place and be there. I was 17. I kind of wanted to go back and start college. I kind of wanted to go back and live my life. And I tell you what, those words did not sink into me. Actually, they didn't sink into me until I was about 10 years later. Until about 10 years from there, where I actually began thinking back and thought, there are people in this world that have no knowledge about Jesus Christ. They have no way of knowing about Jesus Christ. And unless someone goes and learns their language and learns their culture and lives there, man, how are they ever going to hear? Actually, the Bible says it this way in Matthew 24:14, and the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. That's what God is saying to us, is that you guys actually right now have this opportunity to be actually involved in what's happening in the world. There's a passage in Acts chapter 17, verse 6, where the Apostle Paul is going into this place. He's actually heading into these areas throughout Asia, sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. He gets into this one town, and he shares about Jesus Christ. And the people in the town get so upset that he's there that they cry out, "This is the guy that's turning the world upside down. And now he's come here." I don't know about you guys, but that verse has always stuck with me. These are the guys that are turning the world upside down. You know, the answer, the real thing is this right here. Are we people that want to make a difference? Are you guys people that actually want to make a difference in this world? God has actually given us an opportunity to be about salt and light of this world. And he's given us a privilege of being able to communicate that truth. And God has given us this challenge to go to places where they have never heard about Jesus Christ. The Apostle Paul says it this way. When the Apostle Paul had actually preached all the way around, he said this, when his desire to reach the whole world, he said, I preached Christ all the way around from Jerusalem all the way around to Illyricum. I've been preaching Christ all through those areas. And he finally ended it with this thing. He said that now that I've done that, I'm going to quit. Now that I've gone around the world, I've preached Jesus Christ around the world, I'm going to stop. No, he didn't. He said, now I'm going to Spain. Like, Spain isn't the Spain we think of maybe now, because Spain was actually barbarian land. Spain was this crazy area. And Paul said, I'm not done yet, even though I'm old. I'm going to continue pushing forward. I want to go on to Spain. That's what the Apostle Paul challenged. And I think what happens is this, oftentimes that we actually don't know that we can actually make that difference. But we as believers, you guys right here, can actually make a difference. There's a couple of families that are from this community, that worked in this community, that now work with us in Laos and also in China, are sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ in those parts of the world right now, being able to be used. This is my family right here. These are my two boys when they were little. This is us when we lived in Siberia. And that's my wife we just shared just a little bit ago. My son right now is married on the far left. He's now married. My other son is 22 and in school, still in university. But God allowed us the privilege of going to Siberia a long time ago. It was pretty different. Julianne shared a little bit about what it was like. This is what it was like when we first arrived in Siberia. We had no idea what we were walking into. I don't know what you picture Siberia being, or how big Siberia is, or how wild Siberia is, but it was very different than I expected. When I was getting ready to go there, when Julianne and I were preparing to go there, we had no idea what we'd see. But what we did know is this. That the people there were a people group called the Buryats. And I'll show you what they look like in a second. This right here is where we are. That person right there is Julianne. It's about 50 degrees below zero. These are fish, by the way, if you're wondering what that is. And all the markets are outside. And so you'd go shopping outside, you'd live outside, you'd work outside, you'd get around outside. That was life in Siberia for everybody who lived in that region of the world. Way out here in Siberia is over there near Asia, or in Asia. It's by a big lake called Lake Baikal, the deepest lake in the world. And this is what it looks like right here, the Lake Baikal. It's a pretty thick iced lake. The ice is about 13 to 15 feet thick. And so when you actually walk on this ice, there's earthquakes all the time, and the ice will separate, come apart, and then crash back together pretty hard. And those huge monuments, it looks like huge monuments out there taking place. It's one of the weirdest, unique places on earth. But the Buryat people look like this. So if you've ever seen a Russian picture of a Russian, well, this is what the people that we worked with looked like. These guys were Tibetan Buddhists. Their entire lives, the only thing they knew was persecution, because the Russians had persecuted it for years, and actually oppression taking place. And then finally, the Soviet Union, if you guys know much about that, the Soviet Union had fallen apart, communism had kind of dropped off, and then these guys were now out there. There was absolutely no knowledge of truth, no knowledge of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we actually were the first ones to go in there and had the privilege of going in there and walking and working amongst this group of people in this area. I think one thing that we see oftentimes as we look at this type of situations, we realize that God actually has these things for us for a reason. He wants us to know how he works. He wants us to understand how he does things. And in this passage here, where it says here in Acts chapter 17, as it goes on here, they were talking about these guys. They said this, and when they could not find them, this is about after Paul was in this house, these guys came in and screamed that they were being the ones being persecuted in this area. And when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also." And Jason has received them, and they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying there's another king, Jesus. You see, that's actually the message we have. We have this message of hope that says there's another king besides the king that's out there in this world, which is the prince of the air, which is the devil. These guys actually only knew one thing. They were under the oppression of the Soviet regime. They were under the oppression, really, of the worldview that was in their area. They had no knowledge of God. So how do you do this? How do you go there? How would you go there and become a part of that community? How would you go to a place like this with these guys living in this area and actually engage with people? Well, you can dress like they do, which we had to do because it was cold. You dress like them, but you actually had to do more than that. You had to actually get to know who they were. You had to understand their worldview. You had to understand who they were as people. We had to understand why they were like they were. You know the number one issue they faced there? Number one issue for a guy between the ages of 17 years old and 24 years old is suicide. A huge suicide rate. And they actually kill themselves in a really pathetically painful way. One of the challenging places of this area is people actually have no hope. There's zero hope. Life, one of the first things we saw there when we were there was a funeral. It was one of the saddest moments of our life. Actually, I was sitting out there watching it, and this guy was our neighbor, had killed himself. He's about 16 years old, and they put him in his coffin, and they carried him around. They put him right in the middle of the driveway, kind of like this big square there. And people just walked around it, and they played these huge trumpets, and they just blew this horn, continued to blow this horn, and people just stood around there. And then the person brought the body back in the house, and they sat there, and they had no hope. No hope. No idea they'd ever see their child again. No idea that that person ever had any hope of any future. And you know what happens after that was the next day, when he gets buried, you never mention him again. You can't ever say his name. You can't ever talk about him again. And you can never talk about what life was like with him. And they take the pictures that he was in, and they'll bend him down, put him down so you can't see his face anymore. So if there's a family picture, they'll put all the family pictures down with him in it. Why? Why? Because they're afraid for him. Because they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to remember it. They don't want to think about it anymore. They don't want to be reminded because there's no hope. There's no hope. And that's the reality we live in, guys. That's the reality of the world that we live in, that there's no hope in these places. One of the challenges in that is realizing that God actually does give us hope. We actually are able to communicate truth in a way that people understand. One of the things that probably struck home most for me was after we were there for a number of years, we saw a church established. We saw people come to faith in Jesus Christ. We saw guys actually being transformed. We saw that happening in such a unique way that we actually knew that God was calling us on from there to another place. And so we got actually into at this time, we sort of were preparing to go, and so we left this place after this number of years being in Siberia, and this part is part of Siberia, and we moved to another part of Siberia where we were going to start a new work. And this was a challenging time for us because we were saying goodbye to everybody we knew. We were saying goodbye to all the things that we understood, and we got on a train, took everything we owned, put back on a train, and we went another 1,000 miles east in Siberia to another place called Goran Altai. I'd done trains a lot. I've done trains an awful lot in my life. And I'd been on so many trains in my life. And this time I was on with our kids. We're sitting in this train car. We're driving this train car. The train's going along. And as it's going along in the way, suddenly things seemed different. Because I started noticing all these police cars. First off, lined up on both sides of the train as we were passing in. We're getting ready to go into a town called Novosibirsk. And we're getting into this town. As we're getting closer to it, I began thinking, man, what's going on with all these cars here? So I said to my wife, Julianne, I said, hey, look at this. I've never seen this before. All these police cars and policemen by the roads. And then pretty soon they stopped being police cars. They were military vehicles. And then I knew there was something wrong. And then the train stopped. And all these guys jump out of their cars, jump onto our train cars, lock our doors and the gateway things, and jump on top of the train. And now you can hear footsteps going on top of the train. They're walking on top of our train. And the train starts to move again. And I'm thinking, this is not good. So we're going along the way, and about 5 minutes later, I see ambulances all the way along the way, like all these ambulances lined up. And all these guys jump out in hazmat suits, walking down there, and they're walking through your car, and they're starting to spray everybody, all of us, my kids, all of us, with this spray. And I had no idea what was going on, but word was out there that this disease was on our train. And it was this disease that was, like if you watch the news, every disease, every year, some new disease will kill the whole world. This was one of those diseases. This was like an Ebola disease going on. But it was another one, it was a virus that went on, it was called SARS. It was a huge disease. It just started at this time. And people started talking, whispering about SARS. And one of the things with SARS was coughing. And so I was like sitting there going on this line, and I said to my wife, I said, don't cough. Whatever you do, when they come into our car, don't cough. And you tell that to your wife and your kids, don't cough, and then everybody's coughing in our car. So I'm like, stop it. So we're going along down the way, we're driving along, and I'm sitting out there, and as we're getting closer to the town, they come walking through again with the hazmat suits and all the guards, and now this time with guards with dogs, and they're all lining up along the way, and everybody's saying, get back in your room, get back in your room. So we have to sit down in our rooms and wait. And the train pulls up to the station, and we're in Novosibirsk. The whole platform is normally tumbling with people. There's nobody on this platform. And as we're going in, before we get to the town, I see these helicopters flying by with TV cameras all over the place, all lined up around it. And this train is a pretty infamous train now. But at this time, we're sitting out there, and I'm waiting, and I finally walk up to a guard, and I said, can I get off the train? I need to get to I need to have a connection here. I need to get off this train. He said, no, nobody off. Get back in your room. So I go back in the room. I come out about an hour later and say, hey, can we get off again? And he says, yeah, you can get off. And I said, we can. He said, yeah. So I said to my family, grab everything you can, get it off the train really fast. I'm going to try to see if I can get tickets for the next train to get out of this town. I started to run, and I'm the only one running on the platform. Pretty soon I could hear a bunch of footsteps behind me, and it was a bunch of soldiers, guns drawn. I had to go down on my knees, come back to the train car. You have to sit by the train. You can't leave the platform. You can't go out there. Everybody was quarantined. They all thought we were contaminated. So I'm sitting there now, waiting, and another guy gets off the train. And you know what was unique about it? Here's what it was, because you saw what the Buryats looked like, these guys right here? They weren't letting anybody Asian off the train. I actually did not look Asian, and so they let me off the train. Somehow, someone had said, these guys are carrying this disease. And that's what they said. So we can get off the train. And pretty soon in the windows right by me, I see all these faces looking at me. And moms with babies, holding their babies up, pleading, take my baby. Take our baby off there. It became famous. This train ended up becoming called the Death Train. It went from where we were in Novosibirsk all the way to Moscow and then all the way back to China, where the train had started from. I don't know how many people died on it. I don't know how many people ended up dying anyways in this thing, but it was monitored all the way through. But one thing I will never forget is sitting there, I was realizing this, was I knew that I was really glad to be off that train. And I saw how desperately these guys wanted to be off that train. I was happy I was off that train, but I felt for these guys that were on this train because they actually had, in their mind at that point, no hope. You see, that's what the gospel of Jesus Christ is, guys. We, as believers of Jesus Christ, we have the message of truth that can get people off this train. We have the message of truth that can allow people to be free from the bondage they're in. But the real challenge is most of us have never understood that we have that message, that we have this message of life. And the majority of people that you run into even today, even in Orange City, have no idea they're on that train. Have no idea they're on that train. I want to encourage you guys as believers to be difference makers. Man, do not live a common life. Don't just be another person going through life, not engaging. There's a world out there that needs to be engaged with. And we, as Christians, as believers in Jesus Christ, have a hope that's within us. We can actually make a difference. Now, I look around here and I think to myself, man, in this room right here, what God could do if he mobilized this many people, even in this community alone, what a difference it would make. You guys actually have a huge voice. You have a huge voice today because in a couple years, you guys will be decision makers. You guys will be the ones making decisions in life. Man, don't waste your life. Don't waste your life just by sitting on that train and not even realizing you're on it. Don't waste your life allowing people to be on a train like that, but allow God to use you for his glory. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your love. I do thank you for the privilege we have to be called your children. And I thank you for the message of hope that you've given to us. I thank you for the picture that we see in Paul, that he is a world changer. He was a life changer because of what you gave him. I thank you that you have truth that you've given to us. Allow these guys, these young men and women, Father, to be used for your glory, to not be common, but to be uncommon. And thank you for this chance to be here today. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.